In 1985, the primatologist Dian Fossey's body was discovered in her cabin, and the identity of her killers may have been the biggest bombshell of all. Dian Fossey was one of history's most famous primatologists, but she met a truly disturbing and violent end. This is her unforgettable story. Dian Fossey connected very well with animals, and the reason why can be traced all the way back to her heartbreaking childhood. When Fossey was just 6 years old, her parents' divorce turned her world upside down. Her mother, Helen, introduced a new man into her daughter's life, a stepfather named Richard Price. Unfortunately, Price was a horrible stepfather to young Fossey. In his eyes, she would never be his real daughter. Fossey discovered her safe space in the company of animals. She soon learned that though humans could be callous and cold, animals welcomed her into their lives without judgment and with an open heart. When she grew into a young woman, she faced that daunting question all young people face. What do I do with the rest of my life? At first, Fossey had bent the whims of her stepfather, who pushed her towards studying business. However, when she was 19, she spent an unforgettable summer visiting a ranch that reminded her of one irrefutable fact. She loved animals. That's when Fossey let her rebellious nature shine through. Resisting her stepfather's expectations, Fossey decided to go to the University of California instead of his recommended school. Here, she started courses in pre-veterinary studies. However, there was one major consequence to her decision. Due to Fossey's decision to follow her own path in life, her parents made the heartbreaking decision to stop any kind of financial support for their daughter. She would have to work and pay for her education all on her own. It certainly wasn't an easy feat, but every decision she made brought her one step closer to becoming the famous conservationist and primatologist she was destined to become. Fossey kicked off her working career as an occupational therapist, perhaps a surprising pivot away from veterinary studies. But by her own admission, it was her expertise in this area, especially working with children, that became essential to her interactions with mountain gorillas later on. It wasn't until she was 30 years old that Fossey fearlessly dove into the first great adventure of her life. In 1963, she made the daring decision to spend her life savings and take out an $8,000 loan. Why did she need all this money? Well, to travel around Africa, of course. Fossey spent 7 unbelievable weeks in Africa, and it was a transformational experience for her. Beginning in Nairobi, Kenya, with the help of safari guide John Alexander, she explored several places on the vast continent, including Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Rhodesia, today known as Zimbabwe. But that wasn't all. Some of the standout stops on this trip included Ngorongoro Crater and Mount Makino, among others. However, it was while visiting Tanzania's Olduvai Gorge that she met 2 very important people. Lewis and Mary Leakey had set up an archaeological site at Olduvai Gorge to search for hominid fossils. It was there that they crossed paths with Dian Fossey on her journeys. The subject they discussed with her would soon become a major part of Fossey's life. While speaking to the Leakeys, Fossey learned about Jane Goodall, a primatologist who worked with great apes. Little did she know, she'd soon come in close contact with great apes herself. Before the end of her visit to Africa, Fossey saw mountain gorillas in Uganda. This initial interest, as well as the impression she made on the Leakeys, would lead her straight to her greatest passion and simultaneously to her unspeakable end. In her 1983 memoir, Gorillas in the Mist, Fossey wrote about the first time she had a chance to observe the gorillas. It was their individuality, combined with the shyness of their behavior, that remained the most captivating impression of this first encounter with the greatest of the great apes. I left Kibara with reluctance, but with never a doubt that I would somehow return. Fossey returned to Louisville, Kentucky, brimming with stories to tell. She wrote about her experiences in Africa. Her articles featured in the Courier Journal newspaper. However, it would be years before she'd get the chance to go back, something she continued to hope for back in the United States. Fate would bring Dr. Leakey back into her life 3 years later. During Leakey's lecture tour, he stopped in Louisville and met Fossey once again. This time, however, he had an exciting proposition for her. Leakey asked Fossey if she'd consider returning to Africa to study gorillas. It was an offer she just couldn't refuse. With the help of Leakey, Fossey secured the funding for this ambitious project. It was time to quit her job and finally devote herself entirely to what she loved to do. In the 8-month interim, between agreeing to this project and actually touching down in Nairobi in 1966, Fossey had her work cut out for her. She prepared as much as she could, learning Swahili and auditing primatology classes. Finally, at the start of 1967, Fossey began studying gorillas in earnest in the Congo by the Virunga Mountains at Kabara. To get her work done, she certainly didn't shy away from roughing it. At her home base, Fossey lived in a tent alongside her fellow research workers, photographer Alan Root and a tracker named Sanwekwa. They lived off the most humble meals, which predominantly consisted of canned food, though she lived a rather minimalist lifestyle. Fossey also procured a Land Rover she came to call Lily. Every month, when she had to replenish her rations, Lily came in very handy. Fossey would travel 2 hours just to gather her necessities all the way to Tacumba. Both Root and Sanwekwa really helped Fossey get her feet wet, teaching her how to properly track gorillas. It wasn't long before she began to see progress with her research. At first, Fossey found it difficult to approach the gorillas. However, she soon caught on to the nuances of their behaviors, realizing the power of imitation. By copying their noises and movements, she learned how to make these wild beasts more comfortable with her presence. Things were progressing well, but unfortunately, there was trouble on the horizon. Though Fossey operated in her own private bubble, the outside world threatened her peace. Tragically, at this time, the Congo was undergoing a period of radical political conflict, and this threat eventually disturbed Fossey's research plans. In July 1967, Fossey and her comrades fled the Congo after being escorted off of their campsite by soldiers. To make matters worse, the Ugandan authorities gave her one piece of chilling advice to never return to the Congo. Despite the danger of her hasty departure, Fossey wasn't about to throw in the towel so quickly. Instead, she opted to continue her work on the other side of the Virunga Mountains in Rwanda. By September of that year, Fossey found exactly what she needed, a new campsite to continue her work. The spot, the rainforest in Ruhengeri province. Here, she set up the Karasok Research Center. Fossey's site sprawled across 25 square kilometers and could be found 9,800 feet up Mount Bisoking. She had chosen one of the most remote spots possible, and this arrangement eventually earned her a fitting name. To the locals, Dian Fossey became known as the woman who lives alone on the mountain, and this is where she would spend the next years of her life. Fossey soon found that the gorillas on this side of the mountain were shockingly different from the Congo's gorillas. The main issue was that they were far more weary of humans, assuming them to be poachers. Therefore, earning the gorillas' trust became Fossey's first major challenge. Once again, her process of imitation yielded excellent results. Fossey later told the BBC this about her techniques. Her illuminating work and groundbreaking techniques helped make her a renowned figure in her field. Fossey made all kinds of important observations when it came to the gorillas, everything from their diet to their social dynamics to their vocalization and more. Her years of making leaps and downs eventually landed her on the cover of National Geographic magazine in 1970. However, her accomplishments didn't end there. By the time the 1980s rolled around, Dian Fossey had undeniably cemented her legacy. Not only did she have a PhD under her belt, but she was internationally known for her work with mountain gorillas, and she painted them with a very illuminating brush. According to Fossey, she understood gorillas as dignified, highly social, gentle giants with individual personalities and strong family relationships. Sadly, though, the final chapter of her exceptional life, through the 1970s and into the 1980s, was the saddest one of all. During the 1970s, Fossey faced her greatest opposition, not her living conditions or the challenging work, but rather the illicit poachers in her area. You see, though the national park prohibited hunting, park administrators often had a crooked streak and were shamelessly willing to accept bribes from poachers. The poor regulation surrounding poachers became a recipe for disaster, and it led to one of the greatest tragedies of Fossey's life. It was New Year's Eve 1977. A party of 6 poachers came across one of Fossey's study groups, study group number 4, a group of 14 gorillas that just so happened to include her favorite gorilla, Digit. Digit faced down these poachers with commendable ferocity, and as the sentry, he protected his fellow gorillas. The poachers came at him with spears and injured him in 5 places, but the worst was yet to come. Digit acted as a line of defense, taking out one of the poachers' dogs, but though the rest of the gorillas managed to escape, Digit did not. What the poachers did to him was unspeakable. Not only did the poachers sever Digit's head, but they also removed his hands for the most disgusting reason, to eventually be used as ashtrays. They left the rest of his body behind. It was Ian Redmond, a research assistant, who eventually found Digit's grisly remains. Fossey was absolutely destroyed by the news, and would one day refer to his loss as the saddest event in all of my years sharing the daily lives of mountain gorillas. This devastating loss would lead Fossey down a dangerous, and perhaps even reckless, path. The grief Fossey endured in the aftermath of this horror show was all-consuming. She fell into a spiraling depression and stayed locked up in her cabin. Even worse, she drowned her sorrows in alcohol. Eventually, though, her sadness turned into a burning need for vengeance. The loss of Digit shifted Fossey's priorities in a shocking way. Though initially living in the mountains for the sake of research, she now focused her energy on how to stop poaching, and she came at this issue from multiple angles. Firstly, there was the Digit Fund, which focused on fundraising for anti-poaching patrols. This also brought international awareness to this issue. However, she went even further. Fossey wasn't afraid of getting her hands dirty, going so far as to sabotage as many animal traps as she possibly could. Over time, her approach became increasingly zealous, and her actions began to take on an obsessive and aggressive nature. Fossey confronted poachers up close and personal, and on some occasions even held them captive. With the poachers at her mercy, she would get physical with them, scare them, and use humiliation tactics. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. Fossey's vendetta against poachers knew no bounds. Take, for instance, this excerpt from one of her letters, which addresses what she did to one of the captured poachers. She also targeted things that the poachers valued deeply. For instance, Fossey was said to have used their cattle as ransom. Moreover, she allegedly even used one of their children as ransom. If these claims are true, it would suggest that Fossey crossed a significant ethical line in her efforts to protect the gorillas. Fossey left broken traps and burn hunting camps in her wake, but beyond that, she even managed to get inside people's heads. Locals began to see her as someone who practiced dark magic, a belief she hoped would dissuade them from hurting her gorillas. She seemed to welcome this mystical reputation. On top of her efforts to protect mountain gorillas and punish their poachers, Fossey also had her personal problems, most notably her faltering health. From a young age, she'd grappled with lung issues. It didn't help that she was also a heavy smoker. Nearing the end of her life, Fossey's lungs were in pretty bad shape, and she eventually developed severe emphysema. Considering the fact that she lived in the mountains at a high elevation, this was probably one of the worst diseases she could have gotten. Strenuous physical activities, such as hiking, became much more challenging for her. So much so that she even needed an oxygen tank to help continue her work. In the end, however, it wasn't her health that cut her life short. It was something else entirely. On December 27, 1985, Fossey's domestic worker called for her research assistant, Wayne McGuire. He arrived at Fossey's cabin, and upon entering her bedroom, he made the most chilling discovery. Dian Fossey had been brutally slain, her body lying close to the beds. This scene was a nightmare come to life. There was a 9mm handgun found near Fossey's remains, as well as ammo. Shattered glass covered the floor. The furniture was strewn about in a way that made it look like the cabin had been burglarized, but in truth, this was no burglary. All of Fossey's important possessions remained inside that wrecked room, including thousands in cash, meaning that her assailants had a far more nefarious motive. A machete had been used to end her life. However, there was another tragic detail. Dian Fossey kept a diary, and her last entry was beyond heartbreaking, especially considering her sudden demise. She wrote, "When you realize the value of all life, you dwell less on what is past and concentrate more on the preservation of the future." But this wasn't the end of her story. The brutal death of Dian Fossey disrupted the lives of all of her staff members, who were apprehended by authorities, and from here, things got even messier. Though all of the staff were eventually released, it was Fossey's research assistant, Wayne McGuire, who ended up in the hot seat. Allegedly, he was jealous of Fossey. She'd been writing the sequel to her popular memoir, Gorillas in the Mist, and he reportedly wanted to get his hands on her manuscript. Authorities saw this as a motive. Though facing a conviction from the Rwandan courts, McGuire wasn't actually in the country any longer, having traveled back safely to America. Back home, he stood up for himself and completely denied all of the allegations against him, even calling them outrageous. According to McGuire, he had always regarded Fossey as his friend and mentor. However, he would never be able to escape his connection to her demise, and the incident severely affected his job prospects down the road. There are many theories around Dian Fossey's gruesome fate. Perhaps the strongest case can be made for the theory that her anti-poaching efforts made her many enemies, and that the poachers were the ones who sought revenge against her in the end. Though Dian Fossey is often spoken about in a reverential way, not everyone sees her in a positive light. In 2002, a piece written in Wall Street Journal dealt her legacy a dose of criticism, saying that Fossey regarded her guerrillas as better than the African people who lived around her. Though Fossey might be a polarizing figure, it can't be denied that her anti-poaching work had a positive impact on the survival rates of mountain gorillas. Following her demise, their once dwindling numbers were already on the rise. Quite fittingly, Dian Fossey's final resting place is right next to her favorite gorilla digit, in the gorilla graveyard at Karasoke. Please like and subscribe to our channel to bring you these best-kept secrets from Tales That Tell.